Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Dan Sulmasy. I'm the acting director of the Kennedy Institute of Ethics, and on behalf of the Kennedy Institute of Ethics and Georgetown University, I really want to welcome all of you to our webinar on Pandemic Means the Whole World, COVID-19 and Global Bioethics. We had a great deal of interest, over 1,400 people pre-registered for this, so we're excited that people are interested in the topic, and they may also be interested in our outstanding group of panelists as well. In the last few months, it struck me that there's been a lot of discussion in the bioethics community about things like rationing ventilators or access to drugs or the ethics of contact tracing. But in some ways, we have to realize these are really ethical issues for the privileged, and that as a pandemic, COVID-19 affects the whole world, and in a globalized world, it arises in the complex nexus that connects all of us. So I thought it would be important that we begin to talk about the ethics of COVID-19 outside of the domain of the developed world. And we're fortunate to have a fabulous group of speakers with us. They can wave their hands as I introduce them. You may see them over in the little corner panels. Mark Dybul from our Center for Global Health Practice and Impact at the Medical Center here at Georgetown. Larry Gostin, the O'Neill Chair in Global Health Law at the Law Center. David Hollenbach, the Pedro Arrupe Professor in the Walsh School of Foreign Service in the Theology Department. Claudia Ruiz Sotomayor from the Pellegrino Center at the Medical Center. And a visiting researcher here at Georgetown's Kennedy Institute of Ethics, Father Pascal Tchana. Some housekeeping details before we start. First is that this is a Zoom webinar, so your audio and your video are going to be muted. You'll just hear us. Second, we have live captioning available for those of you who would need that. You can do so by clicking the CC or closed caption button in the Zoom controls at the bottom of the Zoom window. For questions and answers, we're going to have a short question and answer period after each of the presentations. And then we'll have two presentations, one on the Mayan community, one on Cameroon, that will be very brief without questions. And then we'll move into a plenary discussion. To ask a question, either of the immediate speaker or for the whole panel, you should use your Q&A feature found in the Zoom control. You click on Q&A, type your question, they'll go to the Kennedy Institute staff, they'll relay them to me, and I'll relay them to the speakers. I should also say this is being recorded, so if you or anybody you know who might be interested misses this or part of this or all of it, you can it'll be available as soon as the program concludes. We are also providing for you through our terrific bioethics research library here at the Kennedy Institute, a resource reading list related to topics, and you can access that list and other information via the research library's website. Lastly, in terms of housekeeping, this is a webinar, so the one thing I don't have to do that I am always used to doing is tell you where the bathroom is. You should know where the bathroom is, and I do hope you find toilet paper. With that, I will introduce our first speaker, the Honorable Mark Dybul, who's a co-director of the Center for Global Health Practice and Impact and professor in the Department of Medicine at Georgetown University Medical Center. Mark has worked on HIV and public health for more than 25 years as a clinician, scientist, teacher, and administrator, and most recently worked as the executive director of the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria. He's a graduate of Georgetown Medical School. He worked at the NIH as a fellow under Anthony Fauci, and he there conducted basic and clinical studies on HIV, including the first randomized controlled trial with combination antiretroviral therapy in Africa. He was one of the founding architects in the formation of the PEPFAR program. He was appointed as U.S. Global AIDS Coordinator with the rank of Ambassador at the level of Assistant Secretary of State from 2006 to 2009. He's written extensively in the scientific and policy literature. He's a member of the National Academy of Medicine. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Dybul to talk to you about COVID as a global disease. Mark.
And the other members. Daniel, thank you for pointing out that this is in fact a global pandemic. And just for clarity for people, because it's misused, and I probably will during this time, COVID-19 is the name of the pandemic, not the virus. The virus is called SARS-CoV-2 for SARS coronavirus 2, because it's very close to the SARS virus, coronavirus, that caused an epidemic, mostly in Southeast Asia in 2003. So I will probably all be referring to COVID-19, COVID, and SARS-CoV-2 in different ways. But I do think it's worth mentioning that this is the first time we have had this type of pandemic in most of our lifetimes. We thought we would have it in 2009 with the H1N1 flu epidemic or pandemic, but it didn't actually kill as many people as we thought, in part because of the response and in part because the virus was different. But this is the first time we've had a easily transmissible disease that affects pretty much every country in the world in a very significant way, which has led to a variety of different responses from across the world. As all of you know, there are about 4.4 million reported cases. I want to emphasize reported. Those are people who have been diagnosed. Even in countries that have done extensive testing, like South Korea, the estimate that for every one reported case, there are 10 additional cases that have not been reported. Some studies from Europe suggest it could be as high as 25 to 1 in countries, or even 35 to 1 in countries that have not reported. So there's no question there are many-fold more disease, people who have had COVID or have COVID or SARS-CoV-2 than that number of 40.4 million. About 300,000 deaths have been reported, as you know. That death, I'm sorry, that's incorrect. The deaths, I just want to emphasize, because we do not know the number of infections, the death rate is unknown. So we do not know how deadly this virus is. What we do know is that the current number is grossly underestimated in terms of a rate, because the rate is the number of people who die against those who are infected, and we only have those reported. Most people believe that we will have a death rate well under 0.1. I personally believe it will be somewhere in the range of 0.2, which is a bad influenza year. There's a big difference between that, an influenza year, and this one. First of all, we have seen it spread rapidly over a couple of months rather than 6 to 7 months. And the nature of immunity has led to a rapid spread in a way that we don't normally see. The United States is by far the most affected, 1.3 million infections as of today, again, reported infections. Russia is rapidly increasing. I'm just giving you some of these numbers to give you a flavor of what's happening around the globe, which many of you already know. Latin America has 427,000 infections reported. Nearly half of those, about 193,000, are in Brazil. And we'll come back to why that might be. However, Venezuela is a black hole reporting very few cases. I think most of us feel that there are, or believe that there are quite a large number of cases in Venezuela that just aren't being reported. Africa has 75,000 reported cases across the entire continent, a relatively low number. It's been proposed by some that that's because of poor testing our health systems. There's not a lot of evidence for that. Some countries are actually testing at better rates than the United States was until recently. South Africa, for example, has 30,000 community healthcare workers that are spreading out across the country, testing people. Sierra Leone has 14,000 such community health workers. or volunteers, depending on the circumstance. By the way, that's more than the United States has, at least documented. Sierra Leone formally has more community healthcare workers doing tracing than the United States does, at least on paper. Africa is a little bit of a conundrum to us. Many people thought it would spread very readily. We don't think that is the case yet, but it could become that way. Again, we do not believe that it's a lack of testing, in part because some countries with a lot of infections like South Africa are testing a lot. But most importantly, even though the virus has been present in many countries for 6 weeks or so, we have not seen significant admissions to emergency rooms with shortness of breath or failure that we would associate with the disease. There are possible reasons for that, including an incredibly young population. The mean age in Africa is 19.7 versus 43 in Europe and about 39 in the United States. And as we know, young people are less likely to be seriously ill. There are countervailing issues related to that. Of course, there are a lot of people who have HIV. We don't know if people who are on antiretroviral therapy are less likely to become infected. This SARS-CoV-2 is a reverse transcribed double-stranded RNA virus, just like HIV is, and it uses some of the same molecular proteins like protease that HIV drugs block. However, there are also other comorbid factors, such as malnutrition, which is rampant, significant population density, which is not a comorbid condition, but leads to more rapid spread of diseases. There's also significant malaria, tuberculosis, which could be a very major problem, especially when many of them are HIV positive. So the risk of spread is fairly high. And as a reminder for those of you who don't travel that much, Southern Africa, particularly below the equator, is heading into winter. And countries like South Africa have very significant flu epidemics during their winters of 60 million people, 10 to 11 million people have influenza. So we are somewhat concerned that we could see a significant increase in infections, particularly below the equator. Temperature, humidity doesn't eliminate the virus, but it reduces transmissibility. And in addition, in winter months, people are closer together, more compact. And if you're living in a township which has a massive population density, that can be a significant problem. So Africa, we need to watch and wait. Moving from the other pieces of epidemiology besides the raw numbers, we are seeing things that we've seen in other pandemics. The difference is we're seeing them on a global scale. Things that we saw with HIV and Ebola, including, for example, who is most at risk, at least most at risk of getting sick. People are more at risk if you live of getting infected, if you live in highly densely populated areas, which is where poorer people tend to live. And you're more likely to be infected if you have comorbid conditions, and also is the case of often poorer people, as I just mentioned, in Africa, but also in the United States. So let's look at a couple of specific examples of the disproportionate impact of SARS-CoV or this pandemic, COVID-19, on individuals. In the United States, many of you will have seen the reports that there is a significant disproportionate impact on minorities, particularly Blacks, Black people, the elderly, and prisoners. Prisoners, of course, are compact in very local areas that don't have great health care. Elderly are always prone to diseases such as this. And Black people in the United States, basically, we should call it out for what it is. Like, you will hear the term social or societal impact, or what we tend to try to make euphemistic. It's really out and out discrimination and inequality. And this we see with HIV in the United States as well, where Black people, Latinos are, and especially poor people, are disproportionately impacted by many diseases. Black people in the United States have much higher rates of hypertension, diabetes, comorbid conditions, lung disease from smoking than others, which is really just a basis of discrimination and inequality. Healthcare workers are disproportionately affected, but they sign up for that. I'm one of them. That doesn't make it any better, but for a healthcare worker, it is something that is part of our responsibility and what we do. That's not necessarily the case for other people who have been court ordered to work, such as meat packers and other businesses and workers who have been, who are significantly at risk because of how they work and where they work. Another part of the epidemiology of the disease related to socioeconomic condition is migrant workers. And I'll give you two examples in the opposite direction. So in Singapore, which is a very wealthy country, the vast majority of their workers are international migrant workers who are not treated particularly well, who live in packed environments. While Singapore did a very good job early on, they had a significant increase in new infections, principally because of the international workforce and the conditions in which they live. In a slightly different setting, Ecuador, there was a massive, really outbreak in Guayaquil, and people were very surprised by that. The reason for that is that Ecuador, and in particular Guayaquil, has a very large number of migrant workers who traveled to Spain and Italy to work. They came home for the Easter holidays and brought the virus with them, and so they had a very devastating epidemic. So migrant workers can either be at high risk in very wealthy countries where they're brought into work, or in their home countries when they come back from wealthier countries after they have worked. The epidemiology of the economic impact is pretty dramatic, and we as healthcare workers actually do follow this. I'm sure others will talk about it more. But the economic impact has been extraordinary, as you know. I would just point out that the reason we follow this is people who have less access to healthcare, poorer people, are more likely to be impacted by this epidemic, in both economically and then perhaps an impact on their health. So for example, it was just reported yesterday or today, I can't remember, that 40% of people in the United States who make more than less than $40,000 a year have lost their jobs as a result of this virus, which also puts them at risk, especially in this country, to not having access to healthcare. And so it's a vicious cycle. And so we as health, especially health policy people, follow the economic impact of health because we know that the economic impact of health, as we just talked about, will have a direct impact both on this pandemic, but will also have a longer term impact on healthcare in general, which is the last piece I wanted to mention, which is the impact of this pandemic, which we have seen with other epidemics on other health. So there are two reasons for this, which we saw in the Ebola epidemic very dramatically. Healthcare workers can refuse to come to work, although we're not seeing as much of that as we had in the past because they're afraid of contracting the virus, in the case of Ebola, when they come to the health clinic. We actually saw, at least in some parts of Africa, protests early that healthcare workers would not go to work unless appropriate PPE and other materials were provided so that they could protect themselves. The second reason is that people don't seek healthcare during epidemics and pandemics because they're afraid to go to a clinic because, of course, they think people are there who carry the virus and they're afraid of getting the virus there. And a lot of healthcare workers who spend time on other diseases are shifted over. And so the availability of health services is significantly reduced overall. As an example of this on a global basis, the Stop TB Partnership just reported a devastating number that the number of new cases of tuberculosis reported has dropped by 70% in many countries because people are not seeking services or healthcare workers have been shifted to other issues. And so the impact, the long-term health impact of the epidemiology of this disease, we have to watch for the epidemiology and what will happen to other diseases, both in this country and around the world, as the pandemic plays out. This happened in Ebola, as I mentioned, similar to the TB number, in Sierra Leone, Liberia, and in Guinea. Basically, the health indicators collapsed after many years of progress in maternal and child health, in HIV and tuberculosis and malaria. Pretty much all the indicators dropped by between 50 and 90%, which is unfortunately what we might see as this pandemic plays out, particularly if it takes off in Africa and in other countries in Latin America. I'd just like to conclude, having gone through some of the epidemiology of the the globalness of the pandemic, the impact, the disproportionate impact on different people, related very much to discrimination and inequality that has economic impacts. Those two things create a vicious cycle of economic impact, disproportionate impact, and inequality, driving further damage to health for many people, including those most disadvantaged to begin with. It doesn't have to be this way. A global pandemic demands a global response. This epidemic has taught us, I hope, what we have known in the past of no one is safe, no one is free from a virus as long as there's virus anywhere in the world, especially in today's world of globalization. As an indicator of that, during the 1918 epidemic of influenza, that was very much related, the first wave and then the second wave, to troop movements during World War I, beginning in Europe, moving to the Southern Hemisphere, and then coming back with a vengeance in the fall. There were 75 million total troops moving during World War II. Last year alone, 234 million international travelers came in and out of the United States. That is the nature of our world, unless we want to go back to the dark ages, where we are all in tiny little city-states with no contact, and even then we had disease spreading. This disease is a global disease that will only be fought with a global response. Unfortunately, we do not yet have a global response. Most countries are very much focused on their own epidemic, which is understandable. It is important that we all understand, particularly those making policies and dedicating resources, that if we focus only on our own response, we cannot be safe from this virus. And so there's a humanitarian call for a global response, but there is very much a self-interested response if we hope to control this pandemic. Some countries did extraordinarily well managing this pandemic, and in their countries, they are almost uniformly countries in Asia that experienced a SARS and/or MERS epidemic over the past 15 or 20 years. After that experience, they put in place the public health infrastructures for identification of cases, contact tracing, although ethically we'll hear about some of the problems of that, and quarantine methods that effectively prevented the virus from getting out of control. The cost for that, to put in basic public health care, basic prevention infrastructures that would have controlled, not ended, but controlled this epidemic, are a fraction of a day of the loss of wealth and resources that we've experienced from this pandemic. So looking forward, we can hope that we will see a response similar to what the countries did that responded to SARS and MERS, and we can create national and global responses that are interactive, that are integrated, so that we do not have to manage this again. And we need to do it immediately because the risk of a second wave of this particular pandemic in the fall is substantially high. I want to end on that positive note that we can actually do this. This is not rocket science. It is perfectly doable from a public health perspective, but also with the fact that communities are stepping up and responding all over the world, as we saw with HIV, as we saw with Ebola. And that should make us all very optimistic about our chances. If we come together, work together, look forward optimistically and with hope, we can do this.
Thank you very much, Mark. That was enlightening and also sobering, I have to say. A number of questions have come in. One of them is asking about what the most effective ways might be to convince the population of a privileged country like the United States, besides maybe the self-interest that you talked about, to be concerned about the disadvantage within our own country and the global response. How do we sort of muster that sort of sentiment within the population?
Well, to be honest, I see less of it in policymaking than I do in the general population. People in communities are actually coming together, supporting each other, lifting up each other, food banks, services for people in need. We saw this in the early days of the epidemic, communities coming together. What policymakers need to understand is that's what our value is, and that's where we want to be as a people and as a community. That's That's what we want. And that's how we responded to the HIV epidemic. And that's how we can respond to this epidemic. But the reality is, and that, you know, we have a policy school like Georgetown and certainly ethics linked to policy. Self-interestedness should not be dismissed simply because we want to say it's humanitarian only. We cannot control this virus if we do not have a global response that supports people to control the number of infections throughout the world. The more infections there are in the world, the greater risk we are at. So, and the more infections in the world, the more death there are. And the more infections in the world there are, the more economies in those countries won't grow, and we can't revive our economy. So these are interconnected things. And I actually sometimes get a little, and there's been a lot about this recently, there's this tension between economy and health. They go very well together. We don't have to separate them. One's humanitarian and one's self-interested. Economies can't grow if you don't have health. We've known this for centuries, literally. And so these are not dichotomous. They're not in tension. They go together, and the stronger economies are, the more health people will have. That is an absolute fact. So let's not try to pull these things apart. Let's put them together as we need to put countries together and see the big picture and the pandemic and the response to it in the big picture that pulls pieces together.
We have time maybe now for one more question, and then we can come back to some in the plenary at the end. But somebody's asking what an integrated local and global response might look like concretely in your view. What kinds of things need to be in place?
Yeah, it's actually not that complicated. It sounds complicated, but it's not. So if you look at the countries that responded, they had national task forces that were pandemic task forces, which we used to have, although it wasn't structured in anywhere near the aggressive way that the countries that responded well did. They put them in place after their epidemics. They actually did simulations, what could be called war games or whatever you want to call them, and actually this happened in Wuhan a month before the outbreak, where they actually just called everyone into the system and said, a pandemic just came, how do you respond? And they actually monitor how you respond. So you're preparing for a next pandemic, integrating across all areas of the sector. The problem in Wuhan is they hid the early infection, so that system didn't kick into place until too late in the epidemic. So think about that that was in Wuhan. Then every major area of China has that, and that's what's possible in countries as well. So that you could have, it's in the United States as an example, every county, every state, and then a national task force basically that is existing all the time, that does simulations, and you have surge capacity both for healthcare workers, community response, and equipment and stockpiles. This is not rocket science. You then would have a global task force that's similarly constituted, that's doing the same things, that's linked to regional, national, and subnational systems through the countries and through the regions. This is not, on paper, complicated. The politics makes it complicated, but from a public health perspective, from what could be done, all you have to do is take the examples of what was done and roll those up, and you get to a pretty strong, competent, and effective response.
Terrific. Well, there are lots more questions, and we have time to have you answer now, but we'll maybe come back to some of those at the plenary discussion, because we want to move on next to our next speaker, Lawrence Gostin, who's the university professor and founding O'Neill Chair in Global Health Law at Georgetown University's Law School. He directs the World Health Organization Center for National and Global Health Law at the law school, and has served on the WHO Blue Ribbon Panel on Global Health Equity, and he co-chairs the Lancet's Commission on Global Health Law and is the Legal and Global Health Editor for JAMA. He's got some expertise here as well. He's worked for the WHO on a range of high-level positions and expert panels, including on Ebola. His book, Global Health Law, is read throughout the world. He holds a number of international and professorial appointments and honorary degrees, and this one was a great little nugget out of his bio. He's been recognized with a Distinguished Lifetime Achievement Award, including the UK's Rosemary Delbridge Memorial Award for the person who, quote, has most influenced Parliament and government to act for the welfare of society. Larry, thank you for joining us, and you're going to be enlightening us a little bit about the global public health ethics of the pandemic. Thanks, Larry.
Thank you very much, Dan, and thanks very much, Mark. It's lovely to see you both, very dear and old friends. I wanted to, we're living through, a once in a century event, and we're all suffering. As Mark said, people of color, people who are poor in low and middle income countries as well are suffering disproportionately, but the upheaval in terms of health, economics, and our social lives, our mental well-being is staggering. But what I wanted to start is with the biology, because it should give us a sense of real humility. So sometime in early December of 2020, and probably earlier, somebody who was a resident of Wuhan in China visited the Hunan seafood and wet market. He was then infected through a zoological jump in species, probably from a bat and then through an animal intermediary to him. Within weeks, silently, Wuhan and wider Hubei province in China were suffering enormous community spread. It then went to mainland China, East Asia, South Korea, Japan, Singapore, Hong Kong, and then it marched through Europe, and then entered North America, and now is, on its way moving towards sub-Saharan Africa, the Indian subcontinent, very unstable countries in the Middle East, Yemen, Syria, Iran, and within a matter of months, we went from a single zoonotic jump to a worldwide pandemic that has affected us all. And that should make us humble, because the awesome power of a little microbe that we can't see that has caused all this. And if it makes us humble, then we would try to take measures to prepare and not be cavalier. And so, that's how it all began. But let me just take you through some of the human rights and social and ethical implications of the march of this coronavirus. First, China reported to the World Health Organization the first case in December 30th. And a couple of days later, it did something miraculously. It shared globally the genetic sequencing data for SARS-CoV-2, which is basically an enormous effort in international sharing. But China's transparency became a problem. Now, many might think, well, China handled it so much better than the United States. Maybe there's something to, a centrally controlled country as opposed to a country like the United States or in Europe or Canada, which are liberal democracies with freedom of speech, freedom of the press. But if we think that, we should pause, because the authoritarian and centralized perspective of governance in China was certainly effective in one way, but in another way it was highly ineffective, because probably by all accounts there would be a month, maybe up to 2 months, when the virus was spreading. During part of this time, China shut down civil society. It censored independent journalists and scientists. It delayed reporting to the World Health Organization. And these things were critical moments. During that time, before it locked down, some 30 million travelers left Wuhan and a wider Hubei province, and that was the seed for this pandemic. So one lesson I think we should learn is that while we need to be ruthlessly efficient, we shouldn't be ruthless socially and from a human rights perspective. That transparency matters, freedom matters, the idea of enabling independent scientists and journalists matter, and they matter a great deal. Very quickly after China reported to the World Health Organization, there was a lockdown, first in Wuhan and then a wider Hubei province, affecting some 50 million people. At the time, I thought it was inconceivable to happen anywhere in the world. We'd never seen it before. It was unprecedented. But yet, we're now seeing those kinds of lockdowns everywhere in the world. But it's operating very differently in countries that respect the rule of law. In China, there were citizen informers. There was censorship of civil society and others. There was state-controlled media. And people were tracked through distancing apps. And they got a red light, green light, or yellow light, and the government tracked all of their location and is keeping all of that location data. That's not something that we would prize from a human rights perspective. But by the time we are fast forwarding to today, we're seeing an epidemic that has actually revealed the best in us and the worst in us. The best in us in the sense that scientist to scientist, human to human, community to community, as Mark said, we have enormous cooperation, goodwill, social solidarity. But at the government level, we're seeing less of that. In particular, we've begun to see a geopolitical struggle going on over the coronavirus epidemic, particularly between the United States and China, each blaming the other, conspiracy theories flying about the origination of the virus in both directions, frankly. And at the same time, the World Health Organization has been caught in the middle. Somehow, the President of the United States has blamed the World Health Organization for taking China's side, as if there was a side in a pandemic like this. There are things that we could course correct for our international institutions, including WHO. And I know I and many of us around the world are thinking very carefully about how we might do that. But ultimately, the World Health Organization has behaved admirably, giving the world ample notice of what they needed to do, very careful guidance. But the world has, as Mark said, broken down into kind of sovereignty, populism, nationalism. You see it in places like the United States, Brazil, China, and other countries around the world. In just a few days' time, we're going to see an unprecedented event. The World Health Assembly will meet, and it'll be the first time since its formation more than 70 years ago in 1948, in a virtual capacity. And there will be only one issue, central issue on the table, which is the COVID-19 pandemic. And how the world comes together on that will be vital, or whether it just separates apart. From an ethical point of view, human rights and transparency and the rule of law are critically important, and I've talked about that. But I also want to talk about the importance of equity and justice, because we've seen this virus in a wily way target the old, the poor, the vulnerable. And this is happening within countries and among countries. It might be very nice for many of us who live in lovely homes. We can telecommute. We have well-stocked fridges and cupboards. We get our employment check, but there are others who don't have that luxury, that are homeless, migrants, that live in crowded dwellings, that rely on paycheck to paycheck, and they can't telecommute. This is a very, very different world, and what COVID has unraveled is the idea of equity and justice, and it's highlighted the vast inequities that we see in our world. And that may play out very well in some of the mega slums in India or sub-Saharan Africa, where it's very, very hard to socially distance. So I've been thinking a lot about this, because one day we will see the end of this pandemic. Well, it might be because we get a vaccine, but it could be a long, long time when we're experiencing this social health and economic upheaval in ways that we've never seen before. Maybe we can take two paths. One path would be, to fight, to have political squabbles, to blame one country against another, to weaken the World Health Organization. But I believe also that out of crisis comes opportunity. I think it would have been unimaginable to think back in the mid-20th century that we could create a World Health Organization, a United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it took a world war for that to happen. And we are in that kind of a size of a crisis. And so I hope coming out of this, we'll see robust health systems and resilient health systems. We'll see global solidarity. We'll see the World Health Organization strengthen and prosper and get the kind of financial and political support that it deserves. And we will return to an idea of one world, all nations in it together. Because if we don't do that, and if we retreat into our little shells, there's every reason to believe we're going to see more of this, with mass migrations, international travel, megacities, climate change, and a whole range of factors will mean that we will have resurgent epidemics. And one day, whether it's in a wet market in Asia or on the city streets of New York City or London, there will be another zoonotic leap, and we'll be in the same position all over again. And the question we need to do is look in the mirror and say, how will we behave?
Thanks so much for that, Larry. Lots of questions have arisen, as you can imagine. One of a person has been questioning the certainty you seem to have this was a zoonotic leap and not something that arose in a laboratory. Would you comment on that?
Oh, of course. I'm very happy to comment on it because absolutely. I mean, the entire scientific community is united in the fact that the most likely, the high probability, including if you just look on CDC or WHO's website, is that this was a naturally occurring zoonotic event. That's what occurred with SARS, MERS, Ebola, and other diseases. In fact, the United States intelligence agencies come to the same exact conclusion. The virus would have had different genetic markers, a different way of behaving had it come out of a man-made laboratory if it were engineered. The president has made that accusation and said that there was a lot of evidence for it. We've never seen any evidence. And so I don't give that very much credit. I think that there's a very high certainty. There's never a certainty on anything, but very high probability that this was a naturally occurring zoonotic event.
Just to clarify, though, there is a difference between an accusation that this was a sort of biological weapons experiment gone bad versus a mutation that occurred in a laboratory and then.
I'm well aware. Yeah, thank you, Dan. I'm well aware of that. I mean, as I say, people who've worked with the Wuhan Biological Institute have said that they really weren't even experimenting with those kinds of coronaviruses. It has all of the kind of beta coronavirus signals as MERS and SARS do. And so, there's an expression in science and medicine that says, if an event is highly likely, that's the way you should be pointing your finger and not at something else. I mean, if I'm wrong or if the scientific community is wrong, let's see the evidence. We've seen none. So as of now, it's a conspiracy theory.
Yes, the clinician's way of saying that is if you hear hoofbeats, don't think of zebras. Right? So
exactly.
But to move to just one more question before moving on to our next speaker, some of the questions have asked whether a sort of one-size-fits-all approach for the whole world from a public health point of view is correct. I mean, there are people, for instance, who are saying that in countries in the developing world that have young populations, given the economic impact of total lockdowns, it might be better to simply let the virus rip through them and develop herd immunity. And they wondered about your response to that approach.
Well, I mean, I agree with it. Of course, I mean, there was a saying from UNAIDS, and I'm sure Mark was involved in this as well, is that there is not one AIDS epidemic. There are multiple epidemics. That's true too with COVID-19. And I actually, a lot of people paint Africa as being, with weak health systems and not technically competent. There's an enormous amount of experience and technical competence in sub-Saharan Africa. They do have very, very different population, a much younger population. They don't, for the most part, have the same capacities for social distancing that we do. And so it might be that a kind of South Korea approach of widespread testing, contact tracing, targeted isolation and quarantine would make much more sense in that continent. But what, from our point of view, and it's something I wanted to raise in my talk, I didn't get a chance to, but what we need to do is provide the kind of capacities for testing, contact tracing, and other things that we need to share those resources. And certainly once we have an effective treatment, we don't really yet. And if we have an effective vaccine, I just had an article in JAMA on this recently, we have to make plans now for the equitable distribution of it to countries throughout the world. And our track record on that is not good.
Well, there'll be a chance again for listeners to ask more questions when we have the plenary discussion. That's been very enlightening. Thank you for your presentation, your answers to the questions, and in the interest of keeping things on time, I think we'll move next to David Hollenbach, who's the Pedro Arrupe Distinguished Research Professor in the Walsh School of Foreign Service and a Senior Fellow of the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown. His teaching and research deal with human rights, religious and ethical responses to humanitarian crises, and religion and political life from the standpoint of Catholic social thought, theology, and the social sciences. His recent book is Humanity in Crisis, Ethical and Religious Response to Refugees. He's taught at Hekima University College in Nairobi, Kenya. He collaborates with the Jesuit Refugee Service, and David is going to talk to us a bit about the sort of justice questions from a global perspective as it relates to the COVID pandemic. David, we're glad to have you with us.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dan. I'm very pleased to be with you and be pleased to be with the rest of the panel as well. And I'm learning a lot from what both Mark Dybul and Larry Gostin have already said. And I would like to, in some ways, build upon what both of them have already implied. They've both been suggesting that there are some very important issues of justice, equity, human rights, and so forth involved in this issue. And I fully agree with that and would like to just highlight it in a couple of somewhat distinctive ways. One of the things that it seems to me that the pandemic does with regard to the state of issues of social justice in our world is it serves, the pandemic does, as both a kind of X-ray machine that shows the deeper structures, or the, if you will, the inner bones of the world system, and how some of those deeper structures are in fact leading to greater injustices in our world today. And we see the consequences of those deeper structures coming to the surface in the fact that there's such an unequal distribution of the levels of infection and death among minority communities in the United States, and the vulnerabilities in very poor countries around the world is revealed. The vulnerabilities economically already, and the vulnerabilities to hunger and other lack of health care, but it's very visible because of the impact that COVID-19 is having and that the pandemic is having on countries and regions and peoples that are already disadvantaged. So it's a kind of X-ray that shows some deeper structures that are a problem. It also, though, magnifies. So as well as being a kind of X-ray machine, the pandemic is a magnifying glass, and it makes some of these effects even more severe, or it magnifies them, or it amplifies them, if you will. And I'd like to highlight a couple of dimensions of that by focusing on two groups that it seems to me are particularly vulnerable to the impact of the pandemic. Those are living in extreme poverty around the world and refugees. We know that the COVID-19 disease has hit China first and then spread to Europe and has come to the United States and has produced some very dramatic effects here and in those other countries like China and Europe and so forth. It has not yet hit, say, sub-Saharan Africa as hard as it has, say, hit the United States. But the vulnerability in a place like sub-Saharan Africa is very great, as Mark Dybul has already highlighted. There is a great vulnerability there, and it comes from several different reasons. Number one, the level of poverty in sub-Saharan Africa is the largest in the world. We can be very pleased that over the last 20 years or so, from 1990 to 2015, the level of poverty around the world, people living in extreme poverty, which according to World Bank definition means living on less than $1.90 a day. The number of people living in extreme poverty has declined dramatically. But there remain around the world 700 million people living in extreme poverty around the world today. And although the decline has been notable worldwide, the number of people living in extreme poverty has increased in sub-Saharan Africa by 9 million from 1990 to 2015. So the number of people living in extreme poverty has grown in Southern Africa. And the estimate is that by the year 2030, 90% of the extremely poor people of the world are going to be living in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, the COVID virus has a particularly great, the COVID-19 disease has a particularly great threat to people living in that part of the world. Let me give two examples of places that are familiar to me from my work in Kenya. One would be the very poor region of Nairobi called Kibera, and the other would be the Kakuma refugee camp, which is located in northwest Kenya, where there are many Sudanese and Somali refugees and so forth. Kibera is an area within the city of Nairobi that's approximately 1 mile by 1 mile in size. It's a square mile. And the estimate is that about 1 million people live there. Needless to say, the density of people living in Kibera is extraordinary. The idea that there could be social distancing in a place like Kibera is it's just impossible. It can't happen. People are so crowded together. They're also living in a situation where there's virtually no sanitation. There's very little clean water. There's no way to keep their hands clean. The people in a place like Kibera are just extraordinarily vulnerable to the COVID-19 disease. And it's beginning to have a significant, they're already taking steps in Kenya to try to overcome this issue or to try to prevent it from spreading too rapidly. But there's been some lockdown in Nairobi and in other parts of Kenya. There's been some restrictions. But just a couple of days ago, I read a report that there was a stampede of people trying to get food from Kibera because they thought that the lockdown was going to lead to the cutting off of food. And so the economic situation, the danger of disease are all intertwined with each other. Another example would be the Kibera refugee camp, or excuse me, the Kakuma refugee camp, which is in the northwest of Kenya. When I was there most recently, there were approximately 400,000 refugees living in this camp. They're in tents. They're in shacks that are made out of wood that's been gathered out of the desert, semi-desert area around Kakuma. It's a very, very minimal kind of situation for any kind of actual protection of health. When I was there 10 years ago, there were over 100,000 people living there, over 100,000 then. There are many more now. But there were 100,000 people living in that camp about 10 years ago when I visited it then, and there was one physician available for the service of those people. And she was a general practitioner who was doing emergency surgeries when needed, when she was capable of doing it, but the healthcare was almost non-existent in the camp. So we've got a situation like this in these countries of sub-Saharan Africa where the vulnerability is very great. And I think COVID-19, the disease, if it spreads in those regions in a way that comes anywhere near the kind of spread that we've seen in Europe and the United States, we're going to see like the X-ray machine showing us the injustices that already exist between there. When I highlight the fact that that refugees are in a particularly dangerous situation, it's because the number of refugees and other displaced people in the world, people forcibly displaced by war and for other reasons, many of them are internally displaced within their own country, like many of the internally displaced in South Sudan, or the many internally displaced in Syria, the internally displaced in places like Myanmar, who are the Rohingya who have been fleeing. Some have fled to Bangladesh, but some are still present in Myanmar. There are today more forcibly displaced people in the world than there have been since the Second World War. It's approximately 70 million people around the world. And of those 70 million displaced people, 88% of them live in developing countries, and 33% of them live in the 10 poorest countries of the world. So refugees are facing this situation in a very severe kind of way as well. Now, the impact of the disease COVID-19 could be great on the refugees, partly because humanitarian efforts to come to their assistance are being disrupted by the disease itself. Humanitarian workers are being displaced or being confined and not able to serve in the way that they would like to. The political consequences of the virus are leading many developed countries to look to protecting their own people and to thus reducing some of the assistance they're trying to provide for developing countries and the refugee population of the world. So there are very great needs there, both revealed more intensively by the X-ray machine of the disease, but also increased by the magnifying effect of the disease on the poverty and vulnerability of these people in these parts of the world. It seems to me we have, as both of our previous speakers have already suggested, a genuine duty in justice to respond to not only the people in our own country, here in the United States or in Western Europe, for example, but to those who are especially vulnerable in the poorer parts of the world. I like to think of that as it is a mixture of a humanitarian or ethical responsibility and a kind of self-interest. I like to think of it as a common good, pursuing a common good of overcoming this disease in order to reduce the common bad of the spread of the disease across borders. The disease, as Mark Dybul highlighted so eloquently, is not containable by boundaries of nation states. It reaches across borders inevitably. And we have to think about how to respond across borders, therefore. And it's not a matter of self-interest or simple altruism, it's both. And that's where I think the notion of the common good is so important in thinking about this. The common good is a good that we share together. The common good is not, the contrast between egotism and altruism is obliterated by this disease. It's not just me protecting myself that's at issue, or me coming to your aid that's issue. It's about how we together can respond to this disease that threatens us together. And that this is a shared good that we have to pursue in response to a shared danger or a shared bad. And this is the kind of thing, it seems to me, that was beginning to be recognized, that was recognized at the end of the Second World War. We've just heard Lawrence suggest that what happened after World War II might serve as a kind of model for where we should be going. I'd like to highlight an episode that occurred here in the United States in the last days of the Second World War that points in the direction, and I think we ought to go today. There was a significant debate in the Roosevelt and then Truman administration when it became clear that the United States was going to win the Second World War. there was a significant debate about what we should do, especially how we should respond to our adversaries, especially Germany, Italy, Japan, and so forth. Henry Morgenthau was the Secretary of the Treasury. And he said, the Germans have launched 2 major wars in the last 35 years that took millions of lives. What we need to do is to prevent them from being able to do it again. And therefore, we should continue our assault on Germany until we have destroyed their entire industrial capacity and we have reduced them to an agricultural society, destroy their capacity to do it again. George Marshall, who was Secretary of State and had been general in the European conflict, had the opposite view. He said, this is the sort of thing that happened at the end of World War I, where we thought by imposing high demands for reparation on Germany, we could recuperate what had been the cost of the war. But in fact, the cost of the reparations was one of the beginnings of the rise of Hitler and led to a continuing struggle and led to the Second World War. So Marshall, along with a number of other men around Truman, a group of men who came to be called the wise men in a book about them, they said, no, not destroy Germany's capacity to fight, but rebuild Germany. Because what we want to do is to create structures and institutions that can lead to the prevention of this kind of war in the future. And what they did was they launched what became known as the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was the beginning of what came to be called the European Steel and Coal Community, which became the Common Market, which became the European Union, and created a structure to prevent the kind of war and leading to peace and leading to prosperity. And it was recognizing that we were in it together with Germany, that if we were going to have peace and prosperity, we needed to work with them, and therefore we needed to rebuild them. And this created structures that lead to the collaboration that prevented war over in Europe for the last 75 years. It seems to me the same kind of challenge is facing us today. How are we going to create the kind of international and global responses and the structures that make those responses possible to assure greater justice, greater well-being, stronger protection of health, ability to respond to these kinds of crises when they emerge, and that those kinds of steps in the direction of rebuilding a world so that the structures that the COVID-19 are revealing are replaced with structures of collaboration. Dean Acheson, who was a very important advisor to George Marshall in the creation of the Marshall Plan, wrote a famous article in which he talked about the need in the aftermath of World War II. He called it the practice of partnership. I would call it the practice of the common good, the practice of working together to build our lives together in a certain kind of solidarity. That's the kind of thing that we need today if we're going to get greater justice in the world today and greater ability to respond to something like COVID-19 and the other kinds of pandemic threats that may emerge in the future. So I would push us in that direction to say that's where we need to go. We had it after World War II because we had some extraordinary leaders. The people around Truman, people like George Marshall, people like Dean Acheson, a number of others, were men of real vision, and they were leaders. They created the capacity to change the direction of history. That's what we're faced with today, the need for that kind of leadership. Sad to say, we're getting the wrong kind of leadership from the present government of the United States. What I would hope we could see is ways that both some of our political leaders and candidates could move us in this direction. I would hope that those of us in the university can try to help our students see the need to move in this direction, and therefore to find ways to help educate them to make a contribution. We can see leadership coming in this direction from the churches. I think as a Catholic priest myself, the role that Pope Francis is playing in trying to advocate response both to the COVID-19 disease, but also to the refugee and poverty situation around the world. Those are the kinds of leadership that we need today. And I would think that if we get them, we can move in the right direction. There's a very interesting article by Richard Haass just recently in Foreign Affairs magazine. Richard Haass is the president of the Foreign Affairs Council of here in the United States. And he said, the good news is that it's possible to create these kinds of institutions. The bad news is that it's far from certain that we're going to do it. So I would like to say what we need to do is find ways to encourage the movement toward the achievement of that good news and avoid the falling into the trap of that bad news of failing to do so. So thanks a lot.
Thanks so much, David. I'm going to bunch together a couple of the questions that have come in that are maybe not as optimistic as you sounded at the end. One person saying we've still got a nuclear arms race, unjust wars, cities being bombed, increasing gaps between the rich and the poor. Isn't it going to just be business as usual after COVID-19? And the other is saying they agree with you, but how are we actually going to take this out of the academic realm and into something that's really concrete in terms of policy development for the world?
Well, I mean, I would just say that I think many people are realizing how interconnected we are because of this disease, because of the pandemic. I mean, pandemic, etymologically, as you used the title for this whole session, pandemic means the whole world, but pan means all, and demos means people, all the people. We're all in it, and that's what the word pandemic means. And I think people, at least a sizable number of people, are beginning to realize that we really are interwoven and interconnected with each other in this way. And what I would like to suggest is if we can capitalize on that feeling, maybe we can overcome some of this tension, this movement toward nationalism, this movement toward who cares about the poor. I mean, if the poor of Africa are inundated with COVID-19 disease, we're not going to escape it. It's going to come back. And even if we are able to bring it under control. So if we recognize that, we have to see that we have to take steps together. I would like to say that building upon that insight that people are beginning to see, that's where we need leadership. And I think we really are not getting it right now. But I'm trying to advocate in a way that I think the other two speakers have already both said that as well. I think if we all could continue to advertise or to push that agenda, maybe we could move in the direction that we need to go. So I'm not sure optimism or pessimism is the right way to decipher the situation. I'd like to say it's more of a challenge to move in that direction. And I think we have the capacity to do it. So I hope we do. I'm hopeful, not optimistic.
Okay, good. Another question relates to sort of cultural sensitivities and cultural practices. So that if you go back to what Larry was saying about the way in which this may have arisen in the wet markets of Wuhan, there are certain practices there of foods that are eaten by people in China, and there may be arguments that we should sort of say, well, you can't, import pangolins, and you can't, import these other kinds of foods and eat them because it's too much of a danger to the world. On the other hand, it may come across as a sort of cultural insensitivity, cultural hegemony from the West talking to the East about these sorts of issues? How do you balance those?
Well, I mean, I would leave it to our physicians and biologists to tell me where there are actual dangers of anything moving across a border, whether it's a certain kind of food being imported or not. I'm not in a position to make any judgments about that. I do think we have to be respectful of people's diverse cultures and traditions, but I also think that cultural traditions can be limited when need be in order to protect fundamental human rights. I mean, one of the fundamental human rights is the right to have one's own culture, but it's not an absolute right. And it's limited by other human rights, like the right to life and the right to, but I'm not in a position to say that anything in particular from China, any kind of food from China should be banned from this country. I have no idea if there are any dangers in that regard. So I will leave that to the biologists and the physicians to answer that question.
Well, maybe we can return to that in our plenary discussion. Thank you for your presentation, your answers to those questions, and we'll move on to next to Claudia Sotomayor, who's going to give us a brief overview on the plight of the Mayans, particularly with respect to COVID-19. Claudia is a clinical ethicist at the Pellegrino Center for Clinical Bioethics and adjunct professor of internal medicine here at Georgetown. She has an MD from the Universidad Autónoma de Chihuahua, a master's degree in bioethics from Anáhuac University, and a doctorate in bioethics from Loyola in Chicago. She completed a fellowship at MD Anderson in bioethics before coming to Georgetown. She's been a research scholar for the UNESCO Chair in Bioethics and Human Rights since 2012, working in the area of multiculturalism, bioethics, and religion. Before coming to the US, she worked in Mexico, first as a primary care physician, but also as a health coordinator for Fundespen, a nonprofit that provides medical care to Mayan communities in rural areas of Quintana Roo in Mexico. So Claudia is going to use slides, which may be a break from seeing the talking heads that we've had so far. Welcome, Claudia, and we're interested to hear what you have to say.
Yes, thank you for having me. It's an honor for me to be here, surrounded by all these amazing faculty. I am a very visual person, so that's why I brought my little slides. And also, I want you to know a little bit of who am I talking about when I say the Mayan communities in Quintana Roo. And this presentation is based on what I've learned the last couple of weeks of how they are dealing during this pandemic. All of these information is brought to me by my acquaintances there and some research that I've done in different websites. So by no means is any official statement from the government or anything like that. Is my opinion. So the first thing I want to show you right here is obviously the map of Mexico, but basically I want you to focus on this area right here. And this is where the Maya civilization settled, at the southeastern part of Mexico, all of Guatemala and Belize, and part of El Salvador and Honduras. Now, for the purposes of this presentation, I'm just going to focus on the communities living in a municipality called Felipe Carrillo Puerto in the state of Quintana Roo, Mexico. Now, this state is very famous. It's very famous because it is a significant tourist destination. You probably have heard of or even been in one of these cities, Cancun, Cozumel, Tulum. And this is attractive to pretty much everyone around the world, and I don't blame them. I mean, look at those pictures, they're amazing. I want to be there right now. But the reason I'm telling you this is because it is so attractive and so well known for the lovely beaches, the ecotourism. It is warm all year long, so people are attracted to these cities. So this is how it is presumed that the virus came to the area. Now, there is a lot of speculation of either, some people are saying it came from a cruise, some people say it came from, an airplane, but what we know is that it was brought by European travelers. And the first spread of the virus happened in this area, which is the touristic area of Cancun, probably in the month of February. But it was in the March 10th when the official statement from the government came across, and they confirmed three COVID positive patients. They did not disclaim more details about where they came from or how they were tracing contacts, etc. They just said, yes, we have 3 cases. So there's a lot of unknowns around this issue. Interestingly enough, it was until March the 30th when they closed the hotels, the beaches, and all the restaurants. Now, as you can imagine, tourism is a big economic engine in this state. And so a lot of people from these rural communities go to this area to work. There's a lot of money in there, right? Well, when the government decided to shut down hotels and all the tourism, people had to go back to their communities. And that's how they brought the virus to their homes. And this is when we get a problem. And it is a problem because I'm talking about very vulnerable communities, very poor sanitation, no infrastructure whatsoever, different cultural beliefs, which makes it very difficult for them to adhere to all the guidelines. And all of this happening in a country that is struggling by itself. Mexico in general is struggling because of the shortage of personnel, because of the shortage of resources, limited hospitals, no vents, no PPE. I mean, the whole country is struggling. So you can imagine all the multi-layered problematics that we are facing here. These photos, I brought them just to show you how they live. There's no easy way to tell them, oh, please, if you are sick, just self-isolate. That's impossible because they live in these little houses. Here, for example, this is it. This is the living room. This is the kitchen. This is the bedroom. I don't know if you take a look at this area where I'm pointing. These are hammocks. So at night, they just pull them down, sleep. During the day, pull them up, and they just, live in there. And this is the house of 2 or 3 families. So how do you ask them to self-isolate or social distance or keep yourself isolated if you're sick? The other thing that I want to point out is the kitchen here. As you can see, this is a stove, a wood stove, and it's inside the house with no proper ventilation. In the outside, no hygiene whatsoever. It is very difficult for them to have access to clean water. Just an anecdote, when I was there, one day I was really thirsty. I was treating those patients, and they're lovely people, very, very hospitable. And one of the ladies asked me, hey, do you want some water? And I said, well, that would be lovely, thank you. And when she gave me the glass of water, I said, oh my goodness, you're so nice. You prepare lemonade for me. And she's like, no, that's just water. So as you can imagine, the water had like floaties and it was, like lemonade. That's the kind of water they have. So to begin with the whole basic hygiene measures, boil the water, wash your hands, brush your teeth. They're very basic, but that's where they're at. And then on the other hand, you have all these host problems. Like the persons you're going to be treating or they're going to be facing this virus are in the high risk population by themselves. You can either find people very malnourished, you know, or a lot of females who are suffering from metabolic syndrome. And then if you add to that the fact that they cook inside their homes with wood, you know, they're inhaling all those fumes. So their lungs, some people have a lot of chronic pulmonary diseases because of that exposure. So we know for sure, it's a fact, that these people are vulnerable or have very high risk factors to suffer from complications from the COVID-19 or of this virus. Now, if we want to add another layer of the problem, is the cultural background. So for these people, health, illness, and healthcare in general is very intertwined and is related directly to the gods. So if the god is sending a disease, there must be a reason for it. And the way they treat that disease is a very communal endeavor where the different healthcare providers, where they have the hierbatero, they have the asobador, and they have the H-man, which would be the main healthcare provider, they all get together and treat the disease. And then the family has to participate, because healing for them is not an act of the mind, but it's an act of the heart. And it is through the heart that the god from the wind and the god from the earth, communicates to them and heal them. So because if it is an act from the heart, the whole family has to participate in the ritual. So now, how do you treat a virus where the person has to be isolated? It's difficult. Culturally speaking, it's difficult for them to grasp. What do you mean I have to social distance if my family needs me to heal? I need to touch them. I need to hug them. I need to pray for them. And we all need to be together in this process. So that's another complication. And then this is the report. This is today's report of cases. Obviously, this is underestimated. I talked to a physician in the area to see how things were going. And his testimony was like eye-opening. He said, well, first of all, we have no testing capacity. So obviously the numbers are really under what is really happening. And the other thing is the message sent to the people is just come to the hospital if you're like really, really sick, almost dying. So only the people who are the most sick are going to the hospital. So we really don't know what's happening inside the houses. Now, I want you to know something very interesting. These areas who are darker are presumed to have more cases. I couldn't print what the colors meant, I'm sorry, but this color meant like less than 4 cases, and that's because there are only 4 cases reported from this area. Now, is it a coincidence that is right when the communities are, that they have only 4 cases reported? I don't think so, especially when we already know that one of the first deceased patients in the area came from this community. And that person spent 10 days with their family in their hometown in the conditions that I already showed you. And then it was when he was very, 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 very sick that he was transferred from this area to Cancun to get treated. And that's when he passed away. When he passed away, what happened in this area was something very interesting. So the Tatich is the supreme leader of that community. He said, this is it, we're going to shut down the city, we're going to block, nobody's coming in and nobody's coming out. With this, we are blindsided. We don't know what's going on in that particular community because the supreme leader is not letting anyone in. And when we asked to this leader, well, what do you think about the virus? Is it a real thing for you? Or, what is your perception? The response was, well, this is a God-sent disease, so there's nothing we can do about it. We're just gonna let it happen. And one thing they do have, these communities, is that they're not afraid of dying. If you saw the movie Coco, there's a lot of that tradition or that beliefs. When they die, they go to the realm of the death and they live with the ancestors, and that's a good thing. So they're not really afraid of dying, and they see it, the way they see it is, well, if this is something that the gods are sending us, we're just accepting it, and it is what it is. So from our side, it's really difficult, it's really difficult to grasp. We want to be there, we want to help them, we want to create conscience, but then there's this building bridges, right, between them, their belief system, and our belief system. And during a crisis, it is very difficult to build that trust and that bridge.
Thank you so very much, Claudia. That really sort of brings some of the questions that were talked about by all our speakers home in a very particular way. We're going to move next to perspective from a different continent. Father Alban Pascal Noudjom Tchana is a religious priest of the Congregation of Priests of the Sacred Heart. He served as a pastor in the Diocese of Noudjom in Cameroon and has experience also as a hospital chaplain. He has a license in moral theology as well as master's degrees in bioethics and in human resources and development. He's presently working on a PhD dissertation for the Universidad Pontificia Comillas de Madrid on the political and moral thought of Michael Sandel in relation to bioethics. And at the present time, he's a visiting researcher here at the Kennedy Institute of Ethics. And Father Pascal is going to talk to us about the situation in Cameroon. Father Pascal.
Thank you very much. I will try to build on what the other people they have said, and talking about the impact of the coronavirus on Cameroonian citizens. I think one of the first things that one may mention before all is to see and to understand that the COVID-19 came to Cameroon around the 24th of February. And the first carrier was a French citizen. And the second case actually was detected on the 6th of March. And it turned out actually to be one of the close relatives. And today I was just looking and on the COVID-19 dashboard of the CCSE, and I saw that actually the number of confirmed cases in Cameroon are rounding up to 2,800. The global recovery around 1,543, and the global death 136. Out of the 10 regions that we have in Cameroon, all of the regions presently are affected. And we have like the three main cities of Cameroon that are Bafoussam, Yaoundé, and Douala. Those are like the 4C center of the epidemic. I would like to see the impact of this coronavirus at 4 levels: the political level, the public health level, the economical level, and the social cultural level. On the political level, I may say that as far as early as March 18, the country prime minister announced 13 protective measures against the COVID-19. And that was, they closed all of air, sea, and land borders. And on the 10th of April, 7 additional measures was added politically. For example, wearing the mask in all public places, local production of drugs, screening tests, establishing a specialized treatment for center for COVID-19, and the intensification of screening campaign and the intensification of campaign awareness in urban and rural areas. It's very interesting because actually out of that big awareness that was made in the country on the national territory, very little impact as for today is really being felt on the situation of the concrete situation of people, because somehow they don't really have access. They are somehow like confused with the situation. One example, for example, simple example may be something that is, like for example, the health system. You know, that is the kind of money that the government allocate to the health sector. You know, it turns around 6 to 7% of the budget of the country, and with that, people, you know, they just feel like, you know, they are not taken seriously. You know, on the public health level, it's good to mention that for people who meet the case of definition of COVID-19, isolation and treatment centers have been set up, like in Yaoundé, in Douala, and in Kribi. And they have been built by the government. And the government actually said that somehow along the line, they were to take care of all the sick people, you know, but, you know, that is not materialized on the field. The general policy of the government actually is based on prevention and awareness campaign. And the big challenge is to make the people actually believe that the existence of the COVID-19, because they don't believe it. You know, they go around thinking that, you know, this issue about the COVID-19 is just like in those days with AIDS. It's an invention of the Westerners to divert their attention from the basic issue of their life. So the outreach worker, they have therefore to fight not only against all the modern form of fake news, the theory of conspiracy, but also against the multiple traditional taboo. Like there is a big taboo in Cameroon on the vaccine. You know, like for example, in Africa, not only in Cameroon, but in the whole of Africa, there is a big and great propaganda on the fact that, you know, people should not allow themselves to be tested. They should not allow themselves to go for example, for the vaccine and so on, because, you know, there is that whole idea that they will be taken like the guinea pig for, you know, for other continents. So right now in Africa and lately in Cameroon, it will be very, very difficult, even if some sort of testing of the vaccine are made, to really convince people to go and to make the testing. Another thing that is very important, unlike China or even America or other countries of Europe, there is a huge access of IT platform that uses like modern technology, like big data, intelligent artificial, you know, like for preparedness and readiness and response to the crisis. Another problem lies on what one can call the clinical case management, like the management of the signs and symptoms, important in the infection curve of the disease. Just looking at the way things are done and how patients are being taken care of, one can fail to ask how accurate is the case fatality rate in Cameroon in absence of testing. So the test deficit is the factor of multiplication or reproduction of the number of cases. Then it's easy in that case to predict that the prevalence of HIV, malaria, cholera, typhoid, tuberculosis, or hypertension and diabetes, coupled with weak health care system, might lead to high mortality rates among comorbid population. And added to that also, some of the hospitals, they have become places of death. You know, like for example, the hospital like in Douala, this have created a kind of psychosis in ordinary patients who think that going to the hospital is comparable to a death sentence because it indirectly implies the possibility of being contaminated. The consequence being that many suffer from illness at home and prefer to give into practice such as decoction and self-medication for fear of going to the hospital, which they see as center of infection. So many affected patients are not aware of their epidemiological status. So they prefer to die without being fully aware of what they are suffering from. And even worse, to know even the cause of their sickness. In Cameroon, also there is another kind of marginalization that is felt is that, for example, the foreign people, many of them are seen as potential patients. So too often, they see them as a vector of the disease transmission. So these people, most of the time, they will not allow to go to the hospital to be tested. They will stay back at home, and that will allow the spread of the virus. And or else they will refer themselves to this decoction, traditional medicine decoction, or witchcraft practices, or even naturopathy. And one of the great cases that we can mention here, speaking about alternative medicine, it's good to mention, some of the treatment that for example, the Archbishop of Douala, Monsignor Samuel Clever, has just put into circulation a potion called MSK. And according to the Archbishop of Douala, with a plant-based protocol, the capacity to cure, he said, COVID-19. And he has received a lot of support from all around the country, and for that many people can help. On the social cultural level, I will end there by saying that in Cameroon it's very difficult somehow to see in a culture where to embrace, in a culture where to kiss, to hug is very normal. Thus to keep that distance is a very difficult work. Like for example, in the north of Cameroon, it will be very difficult to tell them that, for example, where in the culture where they eat in the same plate, where, for example, one of the welcoming signs of hospitality is to see a jar of water in front of the yard, and to go there and to drink from water. It will be very difficult in such a context actually to tell them that you have to keep distance with the others. So all the campaigns actually are very difficult. I'm just ending with my tribe, the Bamileke people in the western of Cameroon, because there is a kind of anthropological problem, because the Bamileke people, for them to die, the moment of the death is very important in the life of a person, and then to die and to see that the public authority, they will take the corpse, that is a first alienation. And then they will bury you far away from your house. That is a second alienation. And then without any reference whatsoever to your ancestor, that's a total alienation. And at the end of the day, there is a kind of anthropological problem over there. To conclude, I just want to say that, it's very important that in contexts like the one that we have in Cameroon and in many other African countries, that they kind of, a new way of thinking about the bioethics, a new way of thinking it in the context that is proper to us, may be set into practice, and to allow people really to join this big struggle for a public health in Africa.
Thank you so much, Father Pascal. We're now in the section where we can do some plenary questions, and many of those are coming in, and some of the other questions have accumulated that I think I can put to either some or all of the panelists. But one set of questions that has arisen, particularly from the last two presentations and some of the other questions that were sent in over the Q&A, relate to questions of cultural sensitivity. And maybe we can put these questions to our more public health oriented experts on the panel to Mark and to Larry. It seems to me that there are great challenges here in trying to implement some of these ideas in a culturally sensitive way. Can you help to enlighten us about ways in which practices like social distancing may not be culturally appropriate, and in the absence of being able to do the sort of testing that I think Larry was talking about because of poverty, what does one actually do to prevent spread of the diseases in the developing world? So either maybe Mark, start with you, and then maybe Larry has something more to say.
Yeah, this is a really important question, and sadly, I think grows out of a history of development and global health that's paternalistic, where we come up with solutions and come and dump them in people's laps and say, here, you have to do this, and do it this way because we designed it this way. How you would effectively implement testing, contact tracing, and quarantine, social distancing, really has to be context specific. So the concepts are there, but they have to be applied in each local context in a way that will be effective. And there are many ways to do this. We actually are privileged to have money from the US government, including in Cameroon, and in Eswatini, Kenya, from the Gates Foundation, to actually do this type of work, to actually allow communities to come up with solutions. How would they do it? That we keep trying, and this is true in this country, to implement from top down. It's never going to work, particularly if you're trying to respond to a pandemic, where community engagement is absolutely essential. And I'd just end by, if you're interested in this, I highly recommend Bill Foege's House on Fire, which is about the elimination, the eradication of smallpox. You know, he's one of the scientists who are researchers and public health officials who designed the approach that led to the elimination. It's a short book. It is 90% behavioral. It's not about the vaccine itself. It was about how you had to find people who were being hidden in their basements who had smallpox, how the implement itself in some cultures to vaccinate with had a negative implication, so you had to change it. But you have to, the concepts are there, but the solutions, how you do them, has to be implemented in a local way, and they will come up with solutions if we just listen to them.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Larry. Yes.
Sure. Thanks. I agree with, of course, everything that Mark said. He's always been a mentor to me. I think, one of the key lessons about, culture and social and behavioral sensitivities goes back to Ebola. We saw that in West Africa with burial practices. We saw it in Liberia when people with spacesuits came and started quarantining people. We've seen it in the DRC more recently, in the more recent Ebola epidemic, with a complete breakdown of public trust and public engagement with political violence. And what we learned there is that solutions do need to be community-oriented. We do need to understand and respect how social mores, behaviors, and cultures operate. That we should not be arrogant. We don't know places in the world, but people there do. And so, listening, partnering, supporting, those are the kinds of solutions that always work best. Public Health Rule 101, gain the public's trust and confidence, and Rule 2, that all epidemics, irrespective, always get solved by bottom-up social mobilization, not top-down dictates.
Great, thanks. I want to try to get a few more questions in, and maybe this one can go first for David and then maybe back to Larry. a lot of the audience, I think, are bioethicists, and they want to know what the role of a bioethicist is in terms of the global ethics of a pandemic. Maybe we'll start with you, David, and then move back to Larry.
Okay, well, I mean, I'm not a bioethicist, but I do think that one of the things is, how do we define bioethics in the world that we're living in? If bioethics is understood in a highly clinical way of one-on-one sort of advanced Western medicine and the kind of treatments that come there and that the ethical issues that emerge there, that's one way of conceiving bioethics, about end-of-life treatments and that sort of thing. But if bioethics is understood to be looking at the kind of cases that we're talking about this afternoon, then bioethics overlaps with what might be called social justice, with issues of social ethics. It overlaps with law. It overlaps with issues of economics and economic and political justice. So I guess the question then becomes, from my point of view, how are you going to define bioethics? And what I would like to do is to say that if we're dealing with a challenge that has to do with human life and human survival and human health, it's bioethical. But that doesn't mean that it's simply a one-on-one kind of question. It can be just as much a question of bio-public health as it is a bio-individual health kind of question. And that's a raising, from my point of view, a question of how to define the scope of bioethics. And I think what you're up to tonight, what we're up to here, is to define bioethics in a fairly inclusive way, rather than a way that says these issues are not part of bioethics.
And Larry, that sounds like it's been keyed up for you to chime in.
It has indeed. Thank you. I think the word bioethics is not the word. Bioethics is, began with the doctor-patient relationship, individual oriented, but our common field together, while that kind of a biological, ethical, medical oriented approach geared toward individuals still remains quite important. We now think in terms of public health ethics, in population ethics, global public health ethics. And there are some very broad principles and values that we bring to this, and these values include many that we've discussed about: the importance of ethical allocation of resources, justice, the rule of law, protection of the common good, and the duties that we owe to one another as a community and a society, and as nations to one another, and that we want to have robust global institutions to help guide us and provide the kind of support and technical guidance that are needed. But there's one thing I've always thought about ethics, is that we in the field of ethics, whether you call it bioethics or public health ethics or whatever, we don't have the right answers. All we can do is offer important values and tools with which we can try to assess what are ethically appropriate solutions to very complex problems.
Great. Thanks. We have time maybe for one last thing from Mark. There have been a number of questions about working in situations in which the governments themselves are actually oppressive or abusive of the people, and the people are distrustful actually of any interventions by the government or public health authorities. How does one act to try to help the health of the people in countries like that. Mark still with us, or is he gone? Oh, there he is. Okay.
Sorry, I was on mute. Are we talking about the United States? I mean, all the polls show the confidence in, you know, our government right now is not very high in this epidemic. There's confidence in health authorities, but not in some of our government. So, you know, this is a very complex question. I think it's what Larry was talking about. It's always just so educational to listen to him about China and the repressiveness of the response. You don't have to respond that way to have effectiveness. Taiwan didn't, but, you know, China acted in a different way. It's a very complex issue, and it gets to what Larry was talking about. What's the ethics? Where's your equilibrium? Are you working for the government? Are you working for people? How do you get information out to people in a way that is meaningful to them? I think it comes back to what we just talked about, which is community solutions. Go to the community and work and talk with them. And you can generally get through. We had to do this with HIV. I mean, there were stories in HIV that in Africa that the CIA created the HIV virus. Similar things happen with vaccines, that they're created to sterilize people in different parts of the world. That's why we can't get rid of polio right now, and why vaccinologists people who in clinics get killed. So it's a very complex environment, but the only way to do it is to be on the ground and work with people and listen to them. And if you do that, you can actually get through anything. As we found out in the early, you know, managing HIV, Ebola. You know, in the Ebola crisis, people didn't always trust the governments in each of those countries. But if you got into the community, you could overcome it. And I would, again, just refer to Bill Feige's House on Fire. He goes through this and how it was done with smallpox. A lot of the countries that had smallpox, the people didn't trust the government. They didn't trust the health authorities. But by going into the communities and working with, it's very intensive work, but it's the only way to do it. I would say the last thing is give facts. People are much smarter than we give them credit for. It's like kids, you know, the kids aren't listening. We don't trust them. If you don't trust the people, they're not going to trust you. Be honest. Tell people what we know, what we don't know, like Larry just did. We don't have the answers to a lot of things. And when we might know it and what we're doing to deal with that. That's why Tony Fauci is such a national asset. That's what he does. And if that's what you do, people will respond positively. And we have many examples of that. And we can trust most of the people because they'll do a great job if we just get to them and trust them to implement.
May I ask a question?
Go David, yes.
Just to Mark and maybe to Larry on this, about you're talking about wanting things to come from below, and I couldn't agree more, building it out of what the people themselves are willing to undertake and so forth. But at the same time, when you go back to HIV/AIDS, PEPFAR, the president's and UNAIDS, these are two significant initiatives on dealing with the HIV crisis that, on one level anyway, came from above. But they did respond to the people from below. It seems to me that we need a mixture of responses that take the attitudes that are coming from below very seriously, but we also need real contributions from above if we're going to address the kind of situation that could be coming in Africa tomorrow.
Absolutely. No question about it. You need both, but in places where the first doesn't exist or where the leadership doesn't exist, you can still actually get quite a bit done. It's a lot easier and it moves a lot faster if you have leadership. And that's what we're seeing in this crisis, where we've had good leadership. There's been a fantastic national response and control. Where there's been poor leadership, things are out of control.
Well, we're unfortunately out of time. It almost seems like we're just getting started here with this great conversation. Thanks to everyone who actually signed in and listened to this. I know I've been educated. I suspect that all of you are as well. Please join me in thanking our panelists for Father Pascal, Claudia, David Hollenbach, Mark Dybul, Larry Gostin. I'd like to thank my staff here at the Kennedy Institute as well, Laura Bishop and Lucas Chandler, for all they did in the background to make this possible. Look, sounds like the real lesson is that we have a lot of work to do, and that's an ethical mandate for all of us. So thank you again, and stay safe and well, everyone. Thank you.